Skip Paul has been farming at Wishingstone Farm since 1985. They're located in southern Rhode Island in Little Compton, where the growing season is pretty long, and they're managing 7 greenhouses full of grafted tomatoes yearly. Skip's going to talk to us about his operation.
Hi there, this is Skip Paul from Wishingstone Farm. We started grafting tomatoes years ago for soil disease reasons. We were having problems with corky root rot and other things. And as the years have gone by, I think we graft as much for controllable and predictable tomato production. Almost that's the most important thing we're grafting for, is the predictable and consistent tomato production. The slides we're going to be looking at here is, unfortunately, it's kind of an old program I presented at the New England Vegetable Growers about 8 years ago. But a lot of the good parts of this presentation, you'll see how we built our own growth chamber. And for those of you that are trying to scratch their heads as to how to approach this, we built our own growth chamber utilizing a new boiler we had just put in our greenhouses. So we'll start with the second slide here. So we built it out of pressure treated wood, and we actually made 3 layers. At the very bottom of this blue area, there's another bench on just off the ground. And so we have 3 layers. The very top layer, if you see in the top right-hand side, we've actually got a grow light, which we thought at the time was important for getting good, consistent starting of tomato plants. But when the bulbs blew out and they cost $80 a piece, we said, I think we can make it with just regular light. Though we do have some, underneath the second layer, you can see we have some fluorescent lights. And they're nothing special. They're not special grow lights. They're just good, powerful T22 grow lights. Another slide showing you how we built the unit. So the unit, you can see we cut into the 2x4s and made room for 1/2-inch PEX tubing. And so we could run the hot water through the PEX tubing and get a nice even heat underneath our tomato plants that we're trying to start. For years, we used the electric heat mats, and after getting electrocuted many times, we decided that it was time to man up and build a hot water system. The one change that you will see in the photographs that we no longer do or found out didn't work well, we used cement board that we're putting right over the top of the PEX tubing. We thought that would be a good idea to dissipate the heat more evenly so that there was no hot spots. But the cement board just gobbled up the heat, and after about 2 months, we took it all out and just replaced it with a nice thin piece of galvanized steel. And you can kind of see that underneath the milk crate there. It's just a thin piece of galvanized steel. And we didn't have any problems with hot spots. Kind of jumping a little bit to actual tomato production. I have a couple suggestions that many times every year, no matter who you buy your seed from, sometimes the germination rate will vary on something that is predictable as Maxifort. 4 years ago, the Maxiforts were way too vigorous, and so we had to start them 2 days behind the Scions to make sure they came together right. So for the first time you're doing this, I would say you just have to spend the time and the money and just do a couple of test strips and get familiar with how your Maxiforts are going to be ahead of or behind your different Scions that you're going to put on top. And I'll tell you, if you're working with Geronimos and kind of hybridized greenhouse tomatoes, you're going to get a much different germination rate with something as old as a striped German. So you really got to get to know the tomatoes you're working with, and because it's critically important that when you go to actually do the actual grafting, that your Scion and your rootstock are within a certain tolerance of size. Let's see. So here's a process that we use. So we actually grow our tomatoes in big trays. Say half of the tray would be Geronimo's and half will be Rebelski or something. And so when they get to a certain size, we actually pluck out the ones that are of a certain size that we're going to try to match to the Maxifort. And we put them in these trays that you can see on the far right-hand side of this slide. We actually take a 98 tray and make them fit into that situation. Another thing before I leave this slide, I recommend to people, especially the first time you're starting to graft, is don't go crazy with 15 different types of scions that you like. If you like Buffalo or Bee Orange and Geronimo, and then you're mixing in some striped German, you're going to have a lot of different things growing at different rates, and you're going to make it more difficult on yourself the first year trying to match them up. So I keep it very simple the first year. Just have 5 or 6 varieties that you're working at any particular grafting phase. Another thing we're doing is with these little mini trays is that we are once they're in the mini trays, getting ready, they're sized up to be matched to the Maxiforts. We want to only bottom water them. You want to really make sure that the leaves stay as dry as possible from now on throughout the grafting process. Spraying them with misters or putting water over the top of them, we just find it's more apt for diseases and other issues to come up. Another thing that's you'll see at the bottom of this slide that we always dip our bottom dipping stuff in a not concentrated, but a 400 to 1 level of oxidate. And we make sure that oxidate is fresh every time we do a dipping, because we've had disease problems from just plain old green mold. Another important thing for us is being aware of how much transpiration is going on with your tomatoes just prior to doing your grafting. If we see a couple of very sunny days ahead of us and we're going to be grafting on a Thursday, Wednesday, the day before, I will take the scions and the rootstock and put them in a shady part of the greenhouse where they're not in direct sun, so that their transpiration will begin to moderate down. And actually the day we do the grafting, that Thursday, if it's the next day, we often don't start grafting till 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Again, just to try to make sure that transpiration is at a lower functioning level and not too strong. One way you can tell if the transpiration is a little bit too much is when you cut your rootstock off. If you see a tiny big bubble of water coming up out of that newly cut rootstock, that can often be an indication that your transpiration in the rootstock is too strong. And in the early years when we weren't aware of this problem, we actually had enough force coming out of the rootstock that it actually pushed off, even with a clip on it, the scion. So managing your tomatoes before you graft is a really important point. This is just an example of how we take our 98 trays and customize them so we can have a good working area that's easy to work on. So we not only cut them into strips of 2, but we cut 2 off the top so they can easily fit into a 10-20 tray or into any kind of situation we want to put them in during their grafting process or the healing process. Let's see. This is another important point I'd like to show people. So nowadays, we no longer use this bottom area. A couple of years, about 7 years ago, we had some grafts down like these were in domes near about 3 inches off the ground. And I came in one day and the heat hadn't been on for some reason, and we opened up that curtain and it was like 38 degrees in there. And I realized for the first time in my life, after grafting tomatoes for years and working in greenhouses, that in January and February, 3 or 4 inches off a cement floor in a greenhouse, it's around 32 degrees. You go up 40 inches and it's like 65 degrees. So we are no longer ever put tomatoes that low to the ground. And our healing chamber now is in the second area where you can see the spray bottle and the fluorescent lights. We now take that area and rub and lower down pieces of plastic, and then we use the same shade cloth that you can see, the blue one here, and this is how we build a healing chamber. And in that healing chamber, what we decided to do, we got rid of the domes, and we went to Target and bought one of those Vicks Vapor Rub humidity steamers that you put in a child's room when they're having chest problems. They have very sophisticated dials that you can micro adjust the humidity on your grafts, and always buy 2 of them, because if one runs out of water, you never want to have an interruption of whatever level of humidity you're trying to have. The first 36 hours is critical. I always tell people that any 12-year-old can graft a tomato, but keeping it alive for the next 48 hours after it is where the real art of grafting happens. And so we put the humidity almost up full tilt when we close up the greenhouse and lower the blue shade cloth. And we're constantly going in there for the first 5 or 6 hours, making sure that humidity level's high. But one thing you don't want to see is when you open up that curtain is to see little Christmas balls of water droplets on the ends of the tomato leaves. That's a sign of too much humidity. So for the first 36 hours, it's pretty much full humidity, and then we begin to lower with the dials on the little humidity Vicks Vapor Rub steamers. We start lowering the humidity, and it's not till day 4 that we actually start taking the curtain and opening it up to introduce light. We want to lower the humidity before we introduce light. One of the biggest reasons for failure of grafts is introducing too much light and introducing too much dryness to the situation. A lot of people forget that a heated greenhouse in January and February is incredibly dry. And if you take your grafts out too early, it's going into that super dry environment. It's nice and warm, but it is super dry. And that could be another reason for failure of grafts. You can see on the left that we're grafting, well, in this situation, we were using 1.5 millimeter. We're now using 2.0 to 2.25. We like working with a little bit bigger tomato plants. It's just the way we've gotten used to doing it. This is the typical tomato plant. It's healing. I've seen better ones, but that's the photograph I have. The only other thing I'd say is just a little talk about regenerative versus vegetative growth. I grew tomatoes for 10 years and never heard of the word regenerative or vegetative growth. And a little tip that we found is that once we get a graft that's healthy and growing well, we put it in a 4.5-inch pot and grow it in our greenhouse, getting ready for it to put it out into the formal grow out house. But one of the tricks we've learned to control the vegetative tendency of grafted tomatoes, we always wait till the plants actually show the first signs of the first flowers before we put them into the ground. Putting a young, very vigorous vegetative grafted plant in a tomato house is going to cause you more problems with rank growth and controlling the size of the stems for clipping and everything else. One of the tricks to successful grafted tomato growing is learning how to control vegetative versus regenerative growth, which you will do later on as the plant grows and you start pulling out suckers and even snapping off tomato leaves to control the overly vegetative tendency of the grafted tomato plants. And here are our tomato plants, just getting their second clipping. Another thing we do in our house is we plant the tomato plants 2 feet apart, and then we let the first strong sucker become the second branch off that plant. So by the end of the season, we have a plant basically every foot in the greenhouse. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Skip. Thanks for sharing.